23 turkey pardoning, if you didn't know what that was. Tradition goes back really to the beginning. The beginning was with John F. Kennedy. They gave him one for Christmas. He sent it back. A few years later, happened again, and then it became sort of a thing. But Reagan was the first one to call it a pardoning, and then after him, it was like every year, let's pardon a turkey. And now we're doing 2 for some reason. And is that going to keep one-upping itself? Is it not enough to just have the tradition? Do we got to keep? We're eventually going to have like a whole flock of turkeys that are all going to be pardoned, and then nobody's eating turkeys for Thanksgiving because they're all pardoned. I don't know. Yeah, it's fine. I mean, I'll eat Spam. I don't care. I really will. So, a reminder for the series that we started last week into the It's a Wonderful Easter series, where we are touching on different characters from the story of Easter, the Passion story that begins, in a lot of these narratives, we're beginning with the triumphal entry and we'll end on the cross, touching on different points throughout those stories of different characters and how they contribute to the Easter story. And what would it be like, a la It's a Wonderful Life, if that person wasn't in the story? Today's story is Easter without Pilate, which is why I showed you that wonderful video to begin with of a governmental action taking place, because governments are just the worst sometimes, aren't they? How many in this room have not ever at one time been frustrated by their government? I mean, for a lot of our politicians, we have a 4-year term, right? Like every 4 years we do it again. So your first year the politician spends that time blaming the guy before him for all the things that went wrong. It's not his fault for the first year because it's all carried over, right? The second year, he's doing all the things that help make his super PAC people happy so that the people that got him elected are staying, excited about him being elected. And then your third year, you might actually get some action done. There might actually be work done for real in the third year, but that third year's actions, you're never going to do anything that's going to incite your critics too much, and you're never going to do anything that makes your party divided. So very careful, tiptoed actions in the third year. And then the fourth year is just wasted campaigning because you got to start all over again, right? Not a whole lot really beefy can happen in a 4-year term before it starts all over again. And that gets kind of frustrating. At least it does for me. I can't speak to it though, really. I mean, how much different are we all even in our own lives except on like a weekly scale, right? So you come out of the weekend into Monday, and Monday is just too early to work on real work, so Monday is just a wash day. Tuesday and Wednesday, you're catching up on Monday, so you're kind of behind, but you're, whatever. Thursday's a day you get real work done, but you don't want to do anything that's going to carry over into Friday that's going to pile up on you, because Friday's going into the weekend, and you want to be able to walk away on Friday having not anything on your plate, right? We're doing the same thing. I mean, we are all politicians in a way, just trying to be careful of that. Nevertheless, doesn't matter where you are in that and how much you agree with that, we know what happens. There are systems in place. There are people in charge, and we have an expectation as citizens, as Christian citizens, as American citizens, either way, to be respectful of that law and those who establish it. And even Paul reinforces that, so we know that this is something that comes from a biblical standpoint. Romans 13, 5 and 6, therefore it is necessary to submit to the authorities. Oh man. Not only because of possible punishment, but also as a matter of conscience. This is also why you pay taxes. Paul, come on! For the authorities are God's servants who give their full time to governing. So yes, taxes too. Paul says that we got to pay taxes because that's part of this. Luke 20, 24 through 25. This is one of those situations where Jesus is trying to be caught in a trap, and they're trying to show him, what do you pay and what do you not pay and whatever. Jesus tells them, show me a denarius, whose image is an inscription is on that. Caesar's, they replied. He said to them, then give back to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's. So there's a lot of things that can happen with those in authority that are in office that doesn't make sense to us. And it makes it hard for us to respect them all the time. Even though we are told to respect them, there are times we say, okay, yes, I'll pay my taxes, but really? Really? Yes, I will listen to what I'm being told and I will follow the law, but really? Sometimes the reasoning behind it is off. And we can see that these politicians a lot of times are wanting to do what they're doing to be people pleasers and not actual leaders. Pilate does plenty of this in our account of him in the Easter story. And he appears in all 4 Gospels. There are different accounts of him, roughly the same story, but we're going to touch on all 4 Gospels a little bit because they all have a little bit more to share than the other ones in different aspects of it. But Pilate himself really acts like one of these politicians a lot in the Easter story. And as we don't have the CNN analysts afterwards, like after the president gives a speech and you cut to the people at the desk that have been listening to the whole thing, and they can say, well, this is what he was talking about, and here's the reference to the quote that he gave or whatever. We don't have that. We're not going to have a political analyst that's going to come in and say all the things that Pilate has imparted to us through the scripture. So we're going to have to read all the context from all the scriptures we have. We're going to have to take that context and determine whether or not Pilate is being a people pleaser or if he's actually taking action, if he's being assertive or if he's just trying to go with the crowd. So the bulk of this is going to come from Mark 15, so let's jump there now. Starting at the very beginning of chapter 15. Very early in the morning, the chief priests with the elders, the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin made their plans. So they bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. "Are you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate. "You have said so," Jesus replied. The chief priests accused him of many things. So again, Pilate asked him, "Aren't you going to answer? See how many things they are accusing you of." But Jesus still made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. So he begins with a good assertive posture, right? Like Pilate has that like politician stance. He's asking questions, and they have power behind them. Like he's wanting an answer, and he wants to know it. And he actually even repeats and says, give me an answer. Like, I'm a guy in charge here, and I'm expecting an answer from you. Give it to me as the person who needs this from you. But Pilate hasn't heard what the Pharisees want yet. See, so he can be a powerful politician kind of guy, like, I'm in charge of you guys, and I want answers. And then when he finds out that these other people here that he still wants to please have an agenda as well, then he has to start playing another little game here. So until that happens, Pilate has his freedom to be the tough guy. But as the day carries on, he's put into more of a public position. Moving on to verse 6. Now it was the custom at the festival. So we have Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. They're kind of joined together. This is the festival is what they're referring to, is the Feast of Unleavened Bread, moving into the Passover. That custom at the festival was to release a prisoner whom the people had requested. A man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising. The crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did, to release someone. So this is Pilate's ceremonial, traditional, people-pleasing moment. This is his turkey pardon right here, right? Like, every year Passover is going to come around. You know that there are traditions established with Passover. And you know that the public wants you to play that role. That you, as this guy in charge of this region, your job, Pilate's job, is to make all of his people happy. They want someone released, he's going to make them happy. And he gets to act in a very decisive way. As a person in power, he gets to have this like definitive, I will pardon this person because this is what I do. And it looks good for what he's doing because this is an action. Like, he gets to do an action and be really governmental without the stress or the pain because this is an expected thing. The people want him to pardon someone. He doesn't have to worry about what are they going to think because he was already supposed to be doing it. They expect him to do it. And it's not something that requires a lot of critical thinking because of that. He can just pick a person and pardon them. And it seems like a no-brainer. If you have two choices between Barabbas, who may have been a murderer if he was the one that killed the people while they were doing this uprising. He's part of a group of guys that were doing an uprising. And you have Jesus, who really doesn't have a record, he doesn't have a rap sheet, he doesn't have anything that would constitute him being the one that should stay in prison. So hey, let's make this a cut and dry thing. I'm going to step up as governor and be like, hey, we got this guy. What do you think? But it gives him a reason to be more political now that there is a choice and the people get involved. Verse 9. Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews? Asked Pilate, knowing it was out of self-interest that the chief priests had handed Jesus over to him. But the chief priests, They stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead. What shall I do then with the one you call King of the Jews? Pilate asked them. Crucify him, they shouted. All right, so now Pilate's in a jam, right? All the political fanfare and the traditional things, all the goofy photographers and the turkey pardonings, it's all going to end in this moment. Everything just goes dark because now he's going to have to make some sort of a choice as a real leader. What am I going to do? Am I going to follow what the people say, or am I going to do what I think makes the most sense? And he knows, this gets recorded in history. Like, this is still a real pardon. This is something that's going to happen for real legally. So outside of their region, outside of this room or this area, what happens when that word gets out that he has released Barabbas instead? He's going to have that to weigh on. Like, what does my choice in this do for my future as a politician, for my future as a governor, as any kind of a leader? He's got to think all that through now, which will take us to him thinking of the crowd. And the crowd is another one of the characters that we'll be touching on in 2 weeks. So I'm not going to get really deep into the crowd. I'll save that for someone else. But I do want to go back and remind you, for the last 2 weeks, I've mentioned a Greek word, and that word was kairos. And I want you to absorb this word and just let this become your new panim. Like, last year was panim, that was our catchword. Everybody should remember that panim means presence, and that's whenever you're referring to the face of God and you're being in his presence, panim was the Hebrew word being used. This is our word this year, kairos. Kairos is time, it is opportunity. It is when Jesus is saying it's not going to happen just yet, or it's not the time for it to happen, he's referring to this opportunity, this kairos. It is a time period as things flow together the way they're supposed to flow. All of the story of Easter is a kairos happening as it has to happen, or else it will not be the story of Easter. So all the things that we would love for Pilate to do, all the ways that we would love for Pilate to act, it would be ideal for him to go against the crowd, make his own decision, and pardon who he wants to pardon. But he has to play his role in this kairos, right? Pilate has his role to play. So what is it that Pilate is bringing to this story? What is it that makes It's a Wonderful Easter Pilate's part to it? It's skirted responsibility, shared blame. Across the board, it is responsibility. What is Pilate doing to be responsible, and does he want that responsibility held on him? Another one of the Gospels that mentions a little bit more about this than Mark does, Matthew 27, 22 through 24. What shall I do then with this Jesus who is called the Messiah? It's the same question. It's the same section that we just read, only from a different gospel. Pilate asked, they all answered, crucify him. Why? What crime has he committed? Asked Pilate. But they shouted all together, crucify him. When Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but that instead an uproar was starting, which is what led to an uprising, which was what Barabbas was a part of. We don't want to see that happen again. He took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd. I am innocent of this man's blood, he said. It is your responsibility. I'm not going to make this decision. I don't want to make this decision. It's too much for me as a leader. I'm leaving it to you guys. I'm passing it off. It's someone else's responsibility now. Responsibility is a very tough thing for a lot of people to accept. There's a fear associated with the burdens and the aftermath that come from being responsible, that no one wants to be left with the weight of an unfavorable decision. At some point, though, somebody's going to have to accept some sort of responsibility, good or bad. For 20 years now, I have been writing with nothing but Sharpie pens. I've always used a Sharpie pen to write with. I don't use Bic pens. I don't use any other kind of rollers or nothing. Sharpie pens. It's one of my weird things, but it's a cool weird thing, and it's something that a lot of people know about me, so every year for my birthday or for stocking stuffers, they know, hey, he's going to like these pens. I'm going to give him a pen and be like, yes, more Sharpies. But it's for a very, very specific reason, and it is this reason, that Sharpies use permanent ink. And I wanted to know and to instill in myself that whenever I sign my own name, I am signing my name in permanent ink. Because I want to own up to my own signature, that if I ever approve something, if I ever say, yes, this is my signature on it, it ain't going away. It's not going to fade that signature is permanent. I want to keep myself in check with the decisions that I made. And it was difficult at first because, not only because, the gravity of commitment, but also because the first Sharpie pens were felt and they bled through the page and I had to put paper behind everything I wrote with, and it was a big mess. It got better. They've improved their technology. They're wonderful now. They also would bleed through your pocket too. If the cap came off, oh, it was horrible. I have a lot of ink stain right there. But it's the responsibility, the ownership of responsibility is something that is very difficult for a lot of people to grasp. But it has to happen. Galatians 6, 4-5. Each one should test their own actions. Then they can take pride in themselves alone without comparing themselves to someone else. For each one should carry their own load. You know that riddle about the farmer and the boat and the chicken and the bag of feed and the fox? Are you familiar with that? No hands going up. Just let the record show on video there were no hands that did that. So I'll just give you the riddle then so you can just think for yourself. There's a farmer. He owns a chicken. That he's got a bag of feed and he's got a fox. And he's got to cross a river in a boat. He's got to get all those things to the other side of the river, okay? But he can only take one with him at a time. If he takes all of them together, once they get over there, if he comes back for another thing, if he leaves the wrong things on the other side, he's in trouble. If he takes the chicken over first, okay, you've got a chicken over there and the fox and the feed are together. But then if you bring the fox over next, the fox eats the chicken when you're on your way back for the feed. If you take the feed over first, and then the chicken eats the feed, you see. So you have to figure out in that scenario, how do you take something over and not lose a thing on the other side of the river because the farmer has to keep coming back. And there's a way to do it, and it makes sense. But whenever I hear the scripture about carrying your own load, I immediately think of this riddle. Because the riddle only really has gravity to it, it only has severity to it as a challenge for us if we're thinking as the farmer. If we're putting ourselves into the shoe of the farmer to take the ownership to know that's the farmer's chicken, that's the farmer's fox, and that's the farmer's feed. If I'm thinking as the farmer, I can't let those things happen to my property. But if I step outside and think, my job is just to get everything across the river, then, okay, fine. I'll just send it over, and if somebody eats it, not my problem, right? If the chicken disappears, I don't know what happened to the chicken. I got it across the river, right? That's the difference here between taking the responsibility and carrying your own load or passing it off to someone else. All those items have to get to the other side. If you need to know how to do it later, I will tell you how to do it later. It's really not difficult. It just takes some extra work. Pilate's decision to hand over Jesus to be crucified, when he washes his hands and says, I'm innocent of this man's blood, it's on you guys. That's him stepping away from being in ownership and being in the boat. Like he's just saying, all right, this is not something I want to be a part of. Go ahead. And because of that, Jesus gets led down a path that takes him into a public trial, to a public execution. When Jesus is put through what Pilate puts him through and Pilate passing him off, he ends up in front of crowds. He ends up in front of witnesses. He ends up being crucified for all to see. If he as the governor had not been tasked with the duty of determining Jesus' fate, Jesus may have been just locked away somewhere. He may have just stayed in a prison and not been given the chance to have witnesses see him go through the outcome that needed to happen for his kairos to happen. In order for the story to go where it needed to go, Jesus needed to be publicly crucified. If we had left Pilate in place and he had made his own decision, or if you removed him completely and someone else were in charge that decided to do it a different way, we may not have ended up with that public sacrifice. But Pilate's responsibility and the way he shifts it is not unique to just him in this story. If you go back and look at John 18, I think I've hit all the Gospels now with John here. John 18, 29 through 31. Some other group here is also skirting responsibility. So Pilate came out to them and asked, what charges are you bringing against this man? And this is the Pharisees he's talking to. If he were not a criminal, they replied, we would not have handed him over to you. Pilate said, Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law. And what do they say? But we have no right to execute anyone, they objected. So the Pharisees, at any point, could have done this themselves. They could have gotten their own hands dirty. They want Pilate to do it. They don't want to be the one holding the stick here. Give it to Pilate, put a law in place, and feed the crowd and say to the crowd, this is the one, release this guy and keep this guy and crucify him because of what he says he should be put to death. That's the Pharisees doing the exact same thing. Someone at some point has to accept responsibility. The chief priests were not willing to have Jesus' blood on their hands. They wanted to go through legal channels so they could justify it for themselves. Pilate didn't want it on his hands. He passes it off to the crowd to let them do it. But what it all boils down to is this. The buck always stops somewhere. At some point, our own actions catch up to us. At some point, someone takes responsibility for everything. A price is always paid from someone's pocket. There is always a price paid. Regardless of who made the final decision, Jesus was ultimately led to the cross to suffer and die. And at some point, we will have to take ownership for our own actions as individuals and the decisions that we have made. And when we reach our final judgment, we won't be able to hand off or point fingers. We will not be able to blame anyone else for our own sins. We will stand trial with no one else to point a finger at. But because of the death that was suffered on the cross, our own death sentence can be spared. Amen. We're all turkeys that don't deserve to be pardoned. Thank God for Jesus.